They said she was lucky he didn't leave her sooner. They said she was just a housewife who didn't understand the pressure of his empire. When Sarah signed the divorce papers, she didn't ask for a penny in alimony. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just put the pen down, stood up, and walked out the door while her ex-husband laughed with his lawyer. He thought he had won. He thought she was walking into oblivion. But he was wrong. Because 3 minutes after walking out of that courthouse, Sarah didn't get on a bus. She stepped into the back of a custom-armored Maybach, owned by the one man her ex-husband feared most. She wasn't leaving empty-handed. She was leaving with the one thing he couldn't steal, her mind. This is the story of how the woman in the shadows became the queen of the board. This is the silent departure. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was louder than the thunder rolling over the Seattle skyline. It was a cheap, plastic ballpoint provided by the court, a fitting instrument to end a 10-year marriage that had been valued at $0.00 by the man sitting across the mahogany table. Sarah Jenkins didn't look at him. She looked only at the signature line. Petitioner, Mark Reynolds. Respondent, Sarah Jenkins. "You're making the right choice, Sarah," Mark said. His voice was smooth, cultivated for boardrooms and investor calls. It lacked the jagged edges of cruelty he usually reserved for their kitchen arguments, replaced now by a patronizing pity. "Honestly, fighting for alimony would have just dragged this out. My lawyers would have buried you in legal fees. This is dignified. For you." Mark adjusted the cuff of his bespoke Brioni suit. He looked every inch the tech mogul he was, CEO of Reynolds Dynamics, a man on the cover of Forbes, a man who had recently outgrown his wife of a decade. Sarah finished her signature. It was steady, unwavering. She placed the pen down with a soft click. "Is that all?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, raspy from days of barely speaking, but clear. Mark's lawyer, a shark-faced man named Gregson, who charged $800 an hour, smirked. "That concludes the dissolution. Since you've waived all claims to spousal support and asset division in exchange for a clean break, yes, you are divorced. Mr. Reynolds will retain the house, the portfolio, and the intellectual property holdings." Mark leaned forward, a flicker of annoyance crossing his handsome features. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to cry, to beg, to scream that it wasn't fair. He wanted the validation of her devastation. Her silence felt like a theft. "You have nowhere to go, you know," Mark said, his voice dropping low, so the judge, currently reviewing a file, wouldn't hear. "I paid the lease on your apartment for 3 months. After that, you're on your own. Don't come crawling back when the reality of the real world hits you, Sarah. You haven't worked a day in 10 years. You're obsolete." Sarah finally looked up. Her eyes, usually a warm hazel, were dark, reflecting the storm outside the tall windows. She looked at Mark not with anger, but with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. "Goodbye, Mark," she said. She stood up. She was wearing a simple trench coat over a white blouse and black slacks. No jewelry, no wedding ring. That had been left on the nightstand 3 days ago. "That's it?" Mark laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. "Goodbye? No screw you? No dramatics?" Sarah turned her back on him. She walked down the center aisle of the empty courtroom. Her heels clicked rhythmically on the parquet floor. Click, click, click. The sound of a clock counting down, though Mark didn't know what it was counting toward yet. She pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the hallway, leaving the suffocating air of the courtroom behind. She didn't stop at the restrooms to check her makeup. She didn't check her phone. She walked straight to the elevators, descended to the lobby, and pushed through the revolving doors into the driving rain. The weather was torrential. The grey sidewalk was a river. Pedestrians were huddled under awnings, waiting for Ubers or buses. Mark Reynolds would be exiting in a few minutes, likely under the cover of a large umbrella held by Gregson, heading toward his silver Porsche Panamera. Sarah didn't wait for an Uber. She walked to the curb, the rain instantly soaking her hair, plastering it to her cheeks. She didn't flinch. As if choreographed by the storm itself, a vehicle pulled away from the line of waiting traffic. It wasn't a taxi. It was a long, obsidian black Maybach, S650 Pullman. The windows were tinted so dark they looked like polished onyx. The chrome accents gleamed even in the gloom. The sheer presence of the car made people on the sidewalk stop and stare. In this part of the city, luxury cars were common, but this wasn't just a car. It was a fortress on wheels. It was the kind of vehicle that carried heads of state, or people who owned heads of state. The car glided to a halt exactly in front of Sarah. The rear door clicked and swung open. A man in a uniform didn't jump out to hold an umbrella. The door opened automatically, revealing a cream-colored leather interior that looked warm and inviting. Sarah didn't hesitate. She stepped out of the rain and into the warmth of the car. As the heavy door sealed shut with a vacuum-like thump, silence instantly replaced the roar of the city. The rain became nothing more than visual streaks on the bulletproof glass. Inside the car, sitting on the opposite-facing seat, was a man reading a report on a tablet. He was older than Mark, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that were sharp, intelligent, and currently filled with a profound, simmering intensity. He wore a suit that cost more than Mark's car, an Anderson and Shepherd cut that whispered old money, not new tech wealth. He looked up as Sarah settled into the seat, water dripping from her coat onto the plush floor mats. "It's done?" the man asked. His voice was a deep baritone, commanding but gentle. Sarah nodded, pushing wet hair out of her face. "It's done, Elias. I signed everything. I waived everything." Elias Thorne, the venture capitalist known as the Widowmaker on Wall Street for his ruthless acquisition strategies, a man whose net worth hovered in the 11 figures, shook his head slowly. "He let you walk away with nothing? He didn't suspect a thing?" "Mark sees what he wants to see," Sarah said. Her voice was changing. The raspiness was gone, replaced by a steeliness that had been dormant for a decade. He sees a housewife who planned dinner parties. He doesn't see the person who edited his pitch decks at 3 a.m. He doesn't see the strategist. Elias handed her a towel from a heated compartment. "His loss is about to be catastrophic. You know the board meeting for Reynolds Dynamics is in 45 minutes?" "I know," Sarah said, drying her face. "Why do you think I rushed the signing?" "Are you ready to come back from the dead, Sarah?" Sarah looked out the tinted window. Through the rain, she saw Mark Reynolds exiting the courthouse. He was laughing, high-fiving his lawyer. He looked like a man who had shed a burden. He had no idea he had just severed the artery that kept his business alive. "I'm not coming back from the dead, Elias," Sarah said, turning back to the billionaire. "I never died. I was just waiting." "Drive," Elias said to the partition. The Maybach pulled away from the curb, sliding into the traffic just as Mark looked up. For a split second, Mark's eyes locked onto the retreating taillights of the limousine. He frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, wondering who in Seattle had a car like that. Then he shrugged and got into his Porsche. He had a company to run, or so he thought. The interior of the Maybach smelled of aged leather and sandalwood. It was a scent that transported Sarah back 12 years, to a time before Mark, before the Housewife of the Year facade, before she had made the mistake of falling in love with a man who loved himself more. Elias Thorne poured a sparkling water into a crystal glass and handed it to her. His movements were precise. Elias wasn't just a billionaire, he was an institution. He owned shipping lines, pharmaceutical patents, and half the real estate in downtown Seattle. But more importantly, 15 years ago, he had been Sarah's mentor. "You look tired," Elias observed, not unkindly. "Exhaustion is the price of freedom, apparently," Sarah replied, taking a sip. The water was cold, sharp. It felt like waking up. "I have the dossier you asked for," Elias said, tapping his tablet. "Mark's financial position is more leveraged than the public knows. He's bet everything on the Project Ether launch next month. He's confident because he thinks the algorithm is solid." Sarah let out a short, dry laugh. "The algorithm is flawed. It has a latency issue in the data processing layer. I told him that 6 months ago. He told me to stick to planning the charity gala." "And you didn't fix it for him?" "I fixed everything for him for 10 years, Elias. Every crisis, every PR disaster, every strategic pivot. I ghostwrote his speeches. I restructured his HR protocols when the harassment suits threatened to sink him in 2018. I analyzed the market trends that led to the acquisition of TechStream. He took the credit for all of it." Elias leaned back, studying her. "Why, Sarah? You were the brightest analyst I ever hired at Thorne Capital. You had an instinct for markets that I haven't seen since. Why did you let him turn you into a shadow?" Sarah looked down at her hands. They were trembling slightly, the adrenaline of the courtroom fading into a deep, bone-weary ache. "Because I believed in the partnership," she whispered. "When we started, it was us against the world. He was the face, the charisma. I was the operator. I thought that was the deal. I thought he loved me for it. But somewhere along the way, he started believing his own press. He started believing he was a genius, and I was just the lucky woman who got to wash his socks. And when you tried to speak up, he told me I was jealous. He told me I was moody. He started cutting me out of meetings, then out of decisions, then out of the conversation entirely. By the end, I was just a prop." "And then he found someone else," Elias said bluntly. "Jessica, the 24-year-old marketing intern. She looks at him like he's a god. That's what he needs. He doesn't need a partner. He needs a worshipper." The car hummed as it merged onto the highway, heading away from the suburbs and toward the gleaming steel spikes of the financial district. "Well," Elias said, his voice hardening, "the worship is about to get expensive. Sarah, you know why I picked you up. It wasn't just charity. I have a vacancy." Sarah met his gaze. "Head of strategy at Thorne Capital?" "No," Elias smiled, a wolfish grin that terrified his competitors. "That position is too small for you now. I'm acquiring a distressed asset, a massive tech conglomerate that has lost its way. I need a CEO to gut it, restructure it, and turn it profitable." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Which company?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He pressed a button, and a screen descended from the ceiling. It displayed a live stock ticker. "Not Mark's," Sarah said, realizing the implication. "You're not buying Reynolds Dynamics." "Not yet," Elias said. "Mark is going to crash that plane all by himself. I'm talking about Vanguard Systems. They're Mark's direct competitor. They're bleeding cash, stagnant, and ripe for a takeover. If you take the helm at Vanguard, you will be going head-to-head with Mark in the same market sector." Sarah stared at the screen. Vanguard Systems. It was a sleeping giant. Old tech, bureaucratic, slow. But it had resources, With the right leadership, with the right strategy, it could crush Reynolds Dynamics within a year. "You want me to go to war with my ex-husband," Sarah said. "I want you to show the world who the real genius was," Elias corrected. "You left with nothing, Sarah. No money. No reputation. The narrative right now is that Mark Reynolds dumped his dead weight. If you want to change the story, you don't write a memoir. You beat him. You beat him at his own game, on his own turf." Sarah looked at her reflection in the dark window. She saw the tired woman in the trench coat, but beneath that, she felt the old spark, the thrill of the puzzle, the chess game. She remembered the way Mark had looked at her in the courtroom, obsolescent. "He thinks I'm going to my sister's house in Portland to cry," Sarah said softly. "Are you?" Sarah reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a flash drive. It was small, silver, and unsuspecting. "This drive contains the uncorrected code for Project Ether," Sarah said. "It also contains the true financial projections for Reynolds Dynamics that Mark hid from the board. I didn't steal them. I wrote them. They are my intellectual property, created before he legally locked me out of the company servers. He forgot I had a backup of my own work." Elias's eyes widened slightly. "That's leverage." "No," Sarah said, closing her fist around the drive. "This is just insurance. I don't need to expose him to beat him, Elias. I can beat him because I know how he thinks. I know his fears. I know he overextends when he feels insecure. I know he ignores the Asia markets because he doesn't understand the culture. I know he fires engineers who disagree with him." She looked at Elias. "I'll take the job at Vanguard, but on one condition." "Name it." "I want total anonymity for the first 3 months. The silent CEO. Mark can't know I'm running the competition. I want him to think his rival is just getting lucky. I want him to feel the walls closing in and have no idea who is building them." Elias extended his hand. "Deal." Sarah shook it. Her grip was firm. The rain outside seemed to lessen, the clouds breaking just enough to let a shaft of grey light hit the skyscrapers ahead. Minutes later, the limo bypassed the exit for the airport and headed straight for the private underground entrance of the Thorn Tower. The penthouse suite of the Thorn Tower was less a residence and more a command center in the clouds. Elias had given Sarah the guest wing, a space larger than the house she had just lost, to decompress and strategize. Sarah stood in the shower, letting the scalding water wash away the feeling of the courtroom. As the steam rose, so did the memories. She couldn't help it. The mind, in trauma, seeks the origin point of the pain. She went back to the beginning, 10 years ago. She met Mark at a tech incubator mixer in San Francisco. She was 26, a prodigy analyst at Thorn Capital, already making a name for herself as a fixer for failing startups. Mark was 28, charming, handsome, and desperate. He had a concept for a logistics AI, but no business plan and no funding. He had cornered her by the appetizers. "You're Sarah Jenkins," he had said, his blue eyes electric with intensity. "Elias Thorn says you're the smartest person in the room. I need to know if he's right." It was a challenge. Sarah loved challenges. They talked for 6 hours. She tore his business plan apart and rebuilt it on a napkin. She showed him where his revenue stream was leaking. She gave him the pitch line that eventually got him his seed funding. He looked at her with awe. "We could be unstoppable," he had said. The romance was a whirlwind. It felt like a merger of souls. They were high on potential, high on the shared adrenaline of building something from nothing. When he proposed 6 months later, it felt logical. It felt destined. "I want you by my side, Sarah," he had promised. "Partners, 50-50, always." But the erasure didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, insidious erosion. It started with the branding. Year 2. "Sarah, babe, the investors are old-fashioned," Mark had said, straightening his tie before a crucial meeting with venture capitalists. "It confuses them to have two voices in the room. Let me do the talking today. You just nod and look supportive. It makes us look stable." She had agreed, for the good of the company. Year 4. The company was taking off. Reynolds Dynamics was going public. Sarah had spent 3 weeks awake, finalizing the S1 filing, correcting the lawyer's mistakes. At the IPO party, a reporter asked Mark about the strategy. Mark beamed. "It came to me in a dream," he lied. "I just woke up and knew the market needed this." He didn't look at Sarah. He didn't introduce her as the co-founder. He introduced her as "my lovely wife." When she confronted him later, he gaslit her. "Why do you care about the credit, Sarah? We share the bank account. My success is your success. Don't be so petty." Year 7. The silence was total. Sarah was no longer allowed in the office. "You distract the employees," Mark claimed. "They don't know if they report to me or you. It undermines my authority." So she worked from home. She became the ghost consultant. Mark would bring home problems, lawsuits, coding bottlenecks, PR nightmares, and dump them on the kitchen table. Sarah would solve them while he slept. He would take the solutions to work the next day and claim them as his own. She stayed because she had invested too much to leave. It's the sunk cost fallacy of the heart. She kept waiting for him to remember who she was. She kept waiting for the partner to return. Then came Jessica, and the discovery. Sarah turned off the shower, the sudden silence of the bathroom, bringing her back to the present. She wrapped herself in a thick robe and stepped out into the bedroom. A full-length mirror stood in the corner. She looked at herself. She was 36. There were fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when she met Mark. But her body was strong. Her eyes were clear. The memory of the incident, the breaking point, flashed in her mind. It was 2 months ago. She had surprised Mark at his office to celebrate the closing of the Tokyo deal, a deal she had orchestrated through back-channel emails Mark asked her to write. She walked in and found Mark and Jessica laughing on the sofa in his office. It wasn't sexual, not overtly. It was worse. Mark was showing Jessica a blueprint. "Look at this," Mark was saying to the intern. "I just came up with this architecture for the new drone grid. It's going to revolutionize the industry." It was Sarah's blueprint. She had drawn it the night before, sitting at their dining table while Mark played video games. "Wow, Mark," Jessica cooed. "You're so brilliant. How does your brain work like that?" "I don't know," Mark sighed, feigning humility. "It just comes to me. It's lonely at the top, you know. Sarah, she doesn't get this stuff. She just cares about her Pilates and her garden." That was the moment. Not the infidelity, though that was there too, but the theft of her soul. He wasn't just stealing her work. He was rewriting her existence to make himself bigger. He needed her to be small so he could feel tall. Sarah had walked out without saying a word. She drove straight to a lawyer. Now, standing in Elias Thorne's penthouse, Sarah walked to the window overlooking the city. Somewhere out there, in the glass tower of Reynolds Dynamics, Mark was probably toasting with champagne, thinking the housewife was gone. Her phone buzzed on the dresser. It was a new phone, provided by Elias. A single text message from an unknown number. Subject: "Welcome to Vanguard." Body: "The board has agreed to the emergency session. 8 a.m. tomorrow. They are expecting a miracle worker. Don't disappoint us. Sarah smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator re-entering the food chain. She wasn't going to disappoint anyone, except Mark. She walked to the desk, opened the laptop Elias had provided, and typed a new header on a blank document. Strategic Acquisition Plan. Target: Reynolds Dynamics. Phase 1. Disruption. She began to type. The silence of the pen was gone. The roar of the keyboard had begun. The headquarters of Vanguard Systems was a mausoleum of 1990s corporate ambition. Located in a brutalist concrete building on the outskirts of Bellevue, it was the antithesis of the glass and steel spaceship that Mark had built for Reynolds Dynamics. Vanguard smelled of stale coffee, carpet adhesive, and decline. At 7:55 a.m., the board of directors sat around a massive oval table that had likely cost more than the current yearly R&D budget. There were 8 of them, 6 men and 2 women, all over 60, all wearing expressions of impatience and skepticism. They were the caretakers of a dying animal, waiting for the inevitable bankruptcy filing so they could golden parachute their way to retirement in Palm Springs. They didn't know the animal was about to wake up. The double doors swung open. Elias Thorne walked in first. The room shifted instantly. Spines straightened. Phones were placed face down. When a man who controls a sovereign wealth fund enters a room, the air pressure changes. "Good morning," Elias said, his voice filling the cavernous room. "You've all read the acquisition terms. Thorne Capital has purchased the controlling stake in Vanguard, but I'm not here to run it. I'm too busy buying countries." A nervous titter ran through the room. "I'm here to introduce the person who will save your stock options," Elias continued, stepping aside. Sarah walked in. She wasn't wearing the soft, beige cardigans Mark had preferred her to wear to soften her edges. She was wearing a structured Alexander McQueen suit in sharp charcoal, the jacket cinched at the waist, the shoulders distinct. Her hair, usually worn in a loose, approachable wave, was pulled back into a severe, sleek, low bun. She looked aerodynamic. She walked to the head of the table. She didn't sit. She placed a single folio on the wood and looked at the faces staring back at her. "Sarah, Reynolds?" asked George Sterling, the chairman of the board, squinting over his spectacles. "Mark Reynolds' wife?" "Sarah Jenkins," she corrected, her voice slicing through the room like a diamond cutter, "and formerly the uncredited chief strategy officer of Reynolds Dynamics." "This is a joke, Elias," Sterling scoffed, looking at the billionaire. "You brought us a housewife? A divorcee looking for a hobby? We are bleeding 40 million a quarter. We need a wartime general, not a socialite." Sarah didn't look at Elias for help. She didn't need it. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah said, "in Q3 of last year, you attempted to pivot Vanguard toward consumer IoT devices. You launched the V-Home Hub. It failed because you priced it at $209 when the market average was $149, and you used a chipset from a supplier in Taiwan that has a 14% failure rate. I predicted that failure in a memo I wrote for my ex-husband when he was considering buying you out 6 months ago. He passed on the acquisition because I told him your infrastructure was, and I quote, held together by duct tape and nostalgia." The room went dead silent. Sterling's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I know your balance sheet better than you do," Sarah continued, beginning to pace slowly around the table. "I know that you have 3,000 patents sitting in a vault gathering dust because you're too afraid to litigate against Silicon Valley giants. I know that your lead engineer, David Chen, is threatening to quit because you refuse to give him a budget increase for the quantum encryption project." She stopped behind Sterling's chair and leaned in, resting her hands on the leather backrest. "You think I'm a housewife?" That is your first mistake. It is also the mistake my ex-husband made, and that is exactly why we are going to win." She walked back to the head of the table and pressed a button on the console. The projector screen lowered. "This is Operation Ghost Protocol," Sarah announced. "Effective immediately, Vanguard goes dark. No press releases, no public interviews. We are going to restructure this entire company in silence. When we re-emerge in 3 months, we won't just be competing with Reynolds Dynamics. We will be eating their lunch." She looked at the stunned faces. "Mark Reynolds is launching Project Ether in 6 weeks. It's a predictive logistics AI. It's flashy, it's sexy, and it's going to crash the moment it hits peak server load." "How do you know that?" asked one of the female board members, a woman named Eleanor, with sharp eyes. "Because I wrote the stress test protocols he ignored," Sarah lied smoothly. She hadn't written the protocols. She had written the math that proved the protocols were necessary. "We are going to launch a counter-product, the Vanguard Shield. Security-focused, reliable, unhackable. While Mark is selling magic, we are going to sell concrete." "We don't have the code for that," Sterling grumbled. "I do," Sarah said, tapping her temple. "It's all up here, along with 10 years of his trade secrets that are legally considered spousal knowledge and therefore not subject to his NDAs. She looked at Elias, who gave her a subtle nod of approval. "You have 2 choices," Sarah said to the room. "You can walk out that door with your golden parachutes and watch your legacy burn. Or you can sit down, shut up, and let me make you richer than God." Sterling looked at Elias. Elias checked his watch. "She's not asking for permission, George. She's giving you a lifeline." Sterling looked back at Sarah. The housewife was gone. In her place was a shark in 4-inch heels. "Welcome aboard, Miss Jenkins," Sterling muttered. "Good," Sarah said, sitting down for the first time. "First order of business, firing the entire marketing department. If I see one more billboard with a stock photo of a handshake, I'm firing the board, too." 3 weeks later, the war was silent, but the casualties were mounting. In the gleaming glass tower of Reynolds Dynamics, Mark Reynolds was screaming. "What do you mean we lost the lithium contract?" Mark roared, throwing a tablet across his pristine white office. It skidded across the floor and cracked against the floor-to-ceiling window. His chief operating officer, a sweaty man named Peters, flinched. It came out of nowhere, Mark. We had the deal with the supplier in Nevada locked down. Then yesterday they called and said they're pivoting to a new exclusive partner. They bought out our contract, paid the penalty fee in cash. "Who?" Mark demanded, pacing like a caged tiger. "Who has the capital to buy out a lithium mine's entire supply chain just to screw me?" "A shell company," Peters stammered. "Something called Phoenix Holdings. We can't trace the ownership. It's buried in layers of offshore trusts." Mark ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time in years. "This is the 3rd time this month. First, the server farm in Oregon gets booked out from under us. Then, 3 of our top data architects resign on the same day to go work for the stealth startup. Now the batteries." He walked to the window and looked out at the Seattle skyline. Somewhere out there, someone was hunting him. "Is it Musk?" Mark muttered. "Is it Bezos? Why would they bother? I'm not big enough yet." Behind him, Jessica, his 24-year-old girlfriend, and now VP of Brand Synergy, was sitting on the couch, scrolling through TikTok. "Babe, don't stress," she said, popping gum. "It's probably just a coincidence. You're a genius. Project Ether is going to be so huge, no one will care about batteries." Mark turned and looked at her. For the first time, her beauty didn't distract him. It irritated him. You don't understand, Jessica, he snapped. Without that lithium, the drone prototypes are bricks. If we delay the launch, our stock drops 20%. This isn't a coincidence. This is a surgical strike. Well, ask your team to fix it, Jessica shrugged. That's what you pay them for. Mark felt a sudden, sharp pang of absence. He remembered a crisis 4 years ago, a lawsuit from a patent troll. He remembered coming home, terrified. Sarah hadn't told him to ask the team. She had stayed up all night, digging through case law until she found a precedent from 1982 that voided the troll's claim. She had saved him. She's gone, he reminded himself. And she's nothing. She's probably clipping coupons in a duplex in Portland right now. Get out, Mark said to his team. Fix it. Find me lithium. I don't care if you have to dig it out of the ground with spoons. 5 miles away, in the renovated war room of Vanguard Systems, Sarah Jenkins was watching Mark's stock price dip by 1.2%. He's panicking, she said softly. She was standing in front of a massive digital map of the global supply chain. Next to her stood David Chen, the brilliant engineer she had convinced to stay by doubling his salary and, more importantly, actually listening to his ideas. We secured the Nevada supply, David said, holding a tablet. The transfer to Phoenix Holdings is complete. Mark has 0 inventory for his drones. He'll have to source from China, which will add 3 weeks to his timeline and raise his tariff costs by 15%. He won't delay, Sarah said, her eyes narrowing. His ego won't let him. He announced the launch date on CNBC. If he pushes it back, he looks weak. He'll rush the Chinese tech. He'll cut corners on the quality assurance. And when he does, David smiled, a wicked engineer's smile. The drones will have a thermal runaway issue, Sarah finished. The batteries will overheat if they fly longer than 20 minutes. You want his drones to fail? David asked. I don't want them to crash, Sarah said. I just want them to be mediocre. I want the world to see that Reynolds Dynamics is flashy, dangerous, and unreliable. And then she tapped the screen, bringing up the schematics for the Vanguard shield. We released the shield, compatible with all existing hardware, safe, secure, American-made components. Sarah walked back to her desk. It was cluttered with papers, coffee cups, and schematics. She was working harder than she ever had in her life. She was sleeping 4 hours a night on a cot in her office. She hadn't been on a date. She hadn't seen a movie. But she had never felt more alive. Her phone buzzed. It was Elias. You're invited to the Tech Innovators Gala at the Seattle Art Museum on Saturday. Black tie. Sarah typed back. I don't have time for parties. Elias replied instantly. Mark will be there. He's receiving the Visionary of the Year award. Don't you want to be there to applaud him? Sarah stared at the phone. She felt a cold fire in her stomach. Mark, receiving an award for the work she had done. The visionary, who couldn't even see the woman sleeping next to him. She typed, I'll be there. She stood up and grabbed her coat. Where are you going? David asked. We have the code review. Handle it, Sarah said, walking to the door. I have to go buy a weapon. A weapon? A dress, Sarah said. The Seattle Art Museum was transformed into a glittering palace of light and ego. The Tech Innovators Gala was the Oscars for people who knew what an API was. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, champagne, and desperate networking. Mark Reynolds stepped onto the red carpet with the confidence of a king. He wore a midnight blue velvet tuxedo that screamed new money. On his arm, Jessica was wearing a dress that was barely there. Silver, sheer, and designed to grab headlines. Cameras flashed. Mark! Mark! Is the launch still on schedule? A reporter shouted. Ahead of schedule. Mark lied, flashing his $1 million smile. The future is arriving next week. He felt invincible. Despite the supply chain headaches, he was the man of the hour. He walked into the main hall, accepting handshakes from senators and CEOs. He felt the envy in the room, and he drank it in like nectar. "They all want to be you," Jessica whispered in his ear, clinging to his bicep. "They can try," Mark smirked. They moved toward the VIP section near the stage. Mark scanned the room, looking for his rivals to gloat. He saw the CEO of Microsoft, the VP of Amazon, and then the room seemed to tilt. At the top of the grand staircase, the crowd parted. A hush rippled through the chatter, starting at the entrance and spreading like a wave. A woman was descending the stairs. She was wearing red. Not a polite, soft red. A deep, blood-crimson silk that clung to her body like liquid armor. The dress was backless, revealing a spine of steel. It had a high slit that showed a leg toned by years of discipline. Her hair was down, a cascading waterfall of chestnut waves. She wore no necklace, just long, diamond drop earrings that caught the light like daggers. She was holding the arm of Elias Thorne. Mark stopped mid-sip of his champagne. He blinked. "Who is that?" Jessica asked, looking annoyed at the competition. Mark felt the blood drain from his face. "That's Sarah." "Your ex-wife?" Jessica laughed. "No way. You said she was frumpy. You said she dressed like a librarian." Sarah reached the bottom of the stairs. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look like an outcast. She looked like she owned the building. She was laughing at something Elias said, her head thrown back, her neck exposed and elegant. Photographers were swarming. Sarah Jenkins, the discarded wife, had returned not as a victim, but as a Valkyrie. "I need to talk to her," Mark said, his voice tight. He handed his glass to a confused waiter and marched across the room, towing Jessica behind him. Sarah saw him coming. She didn't flinch. She simply turned her body slightly, creating a barrier of indifference. "Sarah," Mark said, breathless, stepping into her personal space. She turned her gaze to him. Her eyes were cool, devoid of the warmth he used to take for granted. "Hello, Mark," she said. Her voice was low, modulated perfectly for the noise of the party. "Congratulations on the award. Visionary. It suits you." "What are you doing here?" Mark hissed, lowering his voice. "This is an industry event. It's for professionals. Did Elias bring you as a pity date?" Elias stepped forward, his face hardening. But Sarah put a hand on his chest to stop him. "I'm here because I purchased a table, Mark," Sarah said calmly. "Table 4, right next to the front." "You?" Mark scoffed. "With what money? Did you win the lottery?" "Something like that." Sarah smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "You look tired, Mark. Is the lithium sourcing keeping you up at night?" Mark froze. The color that had returned to his face drained away again. "How do you know about the lithium?" he whispered. "I read the trade papers," Sarah lied. "And I know you. You always ignore the supply chain until it's too late. Remember the microchip shortage of 2019? You ignored my memo then, too." You stay out of my business," Mark stammered, pointing a finger at her. "You're nobody, Sarah. You're history." Sarah stepped closer. She was wearing heels that made her almost eye level with him. She smelled of jasmine and ozone, the smell of a storm. "History is written by the victors, Mark," she whispered, "and the ink isn't dry yet." She turned her attention to Jessica, who was looking at Sarah with a mixture of jealousy and confusion. "Beautiful dress, Jessica," Sarah said. "Be careful with the hem. It looks a little unfinished, like a beta test." Sarah turned and walked away, Elias guiding her toward the center of the room, where the CEO of Oracle was waiting to shake her hand. Mark stood there, paralyzed. She knows, Mark whispered to himself. She knows about the lithium. She's just guessing, Jessica said, tugging his arm. Come on, babe. The ceremony is starting. But Mark couldn't move. He watched his ex-wife work the room. He watched her laugh with the titans of industry. He watched them lean in to listen to her. For the first time in 10 years, Mark Reynolds felt small. The lights dimmed. The ceremony began. And now, the announcer boomed, to present the award for Disruptor of the Year, please welcome the newly appointed interim CEO of Vanguard Systems. Mark clapped politely, expecting some old grey-haired man in a suit. Ms. Sarah Jenkins. The room erupted in applause. Mark dropped his champagne glass. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound lost in the cheering. Sarah walked onto the stage. She stood behind the podium, the microphone gleaming in front of her. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes finding Mark's in the darkness. Thank you, she said, her voice amplified, filling the hall. Disruption is an interesting word. We often think it means breaking things. But sometimes disruption is just fixing what was broken by people who were too arrogant to notice. She smiled. Mark felt the ground beneath him crumble. She wasn't just back. She was the enemy, and she was holding the microphone. The Monday morning following the gala, the atmosphere at Reynolds Dynamics was not one of celebration, but of a prison riot containment. The stock had wobbled, just a fraction of a percentage point, but for a company valued on hype, a wobble was a tremor before an earthquake. Mark Reynolds sat in his corner office, the lights dimmed, watching a replay of the gala on a loop. Specifically, the moment Sarah took the podium. Disruption is just fixing what was broken by people who were too arrogant to notice. He paused the video. Her face was frozen on the 85-inch screen. Calm, authoritative, unrecognizable. She's bluffing, Mark muttered to the empty room. She's a figurehead. Elias put her there to rattle me. She doesn't know the tech. She can't know the tech. But the lithium deal. She knew about the lithium. The door burst open. It was Peters, the COO, looking like he hadn't slept in 3 days. Mark, we have a problem with the guidance chips from Shenzhen, Peters said, bypassing the usual pleasantries. The new batch, the ones we rushed to replace the Nevada shortage, they're running hot. During the simulation this morning, the core temperature of the drone swarm spiked to 190 degrees after 15 minutes of flight. Mark spun his chair around. 190 degrees triggers the emergency shutdown protocol. Exactly, Peters said, wiping sweat from his forehead. If the drones shut down mid-air, they fall out of the sky. We need to delay the launch, Mark. We need at least 3 weeks to recalibrate the cooling systems or source new chips. Delay? Mark stood up, his voice rising. Did you see who the press is talking about this morning? Vanguard. They're talking about Sarah. The return of the Queen, TechCrunch called her. If we delay, we admit weakness. If we delay, she wins the news cycle. If we launch and the drones fail, we lose the company, Peters argued, finding a rare backbone. Mark walked to the window. He looked out at the city, feeling the walls closing in. He felt that familiar itch, the need to be the smartest person in the room, the need to prove that he was the architect of his own destiny. He couldn't let Sarah see him bleed. Override the safety protocol, Mark said quietly. Peters blinked. What? The shutdown trigger. Raise the threshold to 210 degrees, Mark commanded, turning back to his COO. The demo only lasts 12 minutes. The drones won't have time to reach critical failure. We fly them. We wow the investors. We close the pre-orders. And then we fix the cooling issue with a firmware patch next month. Mark, That is reckless. That's negligent. Do it. Mark slammed his hand on the desk, cracking the glass surface. I am the CEO. I built this company from a garage. Do not tell me what is reckless. Sarah thinks she can spook me. I'm pushing the launch up. We go live in 48 hours. Wednesday, we crush her before she even gets her office chair warm. Peters stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I want it on record that I advised against this. Noted, Mark sneered. Now get out. As the door closed, Mark pulled a bottle of whiskey from his drawer. It was Tenor Seared, Quart M. He poured a shot. His hand was shaking. He picked up his phone and dialed a number, a private investigator he had kept on retainer for competitive intelligence. It's Reynolds, Mark said. I want you to dig deeper on Sarah Jenkins. I want to know who she's sleeping with. I want to know what medication she takes. I want to know if she has a gambling debt. Find me something I can leak to the press by Wednesday morning. I want her humiliated. Mr. Reynolds, the PI's voice came through, gravelly and bored. I already ran the preliminary check you asked for last night. She's clean. Cleaner than a nun. She works 18 hours a day. She sleeps at the office. No boyfriend. No drugs. No debt. Keep digging, Mark screamed. Everyone has a secret. Actually, the PI paused. I did find something interesting. But not about her. About the IP transfer. What about it? The patent for the core navigation algorithm. The one you're using for Project Ether? The original filing date was 4 years ago. The name on the original timestamp in the metadata isn't yours. It's S. Jenkins. If she wanted to, she could claim you stole it. Mark felt a cold chill settle in his stomach. He remembered that night. He had been drunk. She had been coding on his laptop. He had just submitted the file the next morning under his own login. She signed a waiver in the divorce, Mark whispered, more to reassure himself than the PI. She waived all assets. Intellectual property rights are tricky, boss. Moral rights can't always be waived. If she proves fraud, she won't, Mark snapped. She's soft. She doesn't have the stomach for a legal war. He hung up. He looked at the whiskey. He drank it. She was soft. She had to be. She was the woman who baked muffins. She wasn't a killer. He was wrong. Wednesday arrived with the fanfare of a coronation. The Reynolds Dynamics campus was draped in banners. A massive stage had been erected in the central plaza, surrounded by bleachers filled with investors, journalists, and tech influencers. A live stream audience of 3 million watched online. It was a spectacle. Backstage, Mark was being prepped by a makeup artist. He looked pale. He hadn't slept in 2 days. The override on the temperature sensors was in place. The drones would fly hot. 5 minutes, Mr. Reynolds, the stage manager said. Mark stood up. He looked in the mirror. Showtime, he whispered. You are the visionary. You are the god. He walked out to the roar of the crowd. The music pumped. Heavy bass, synthetic, futuristic. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark shouted, pacing the stage, feeding off the energy. For a decade, we have promised you the future. Today, we deliver it. The world is chaotic. Logistics are broken. But what if the sky itself could carry your burdens? He gestured to the sky. I give you Project Ether. From behind the stage, a swarm of 500 quadcopters rose into the air. They moved in perfect unison, a fluid cloud of black, plastic, and blue LED lights. They formed shapes, a globe, a package, the Reynolds logo. The crowd gasped. It was mesmerizing. In the VIP box, Jessica clapped wildly, checking her Instagram engagement. But in a high-rise office building 3 miles away, Sarah Jenkins watched the live stream on a monitor. Beside her, David Chen was watching the telemetry data they were scraping from the public radio frequencies. "He did it," David said, stunned. "It's working." "Wait," Sarah said. Her eyes were fixed on the thermal readout overlay David had hacked together. "Look at the heat signatures." On the screen, the blue dots representing the drones were turning yellow, then orange. "He overrode the safeties," Sarah whispered, realizing the magnitude of his hubris. "He turned off the limiters." On the stage, Mark was beaming. "These drones are autonomous. They think, they adapt, they are uncrashable." "Temperature at 205 degrees, David read out. 208, 212. "Sarah, the plastic casings are going to melt." "The battery shielding will fail first," Sarah said. "Gravity is about to file a complaint." On the screen, the swarm was hovering over the audience, preparing for the finale, a complex spiral descent. Suddenly, drone Marmophore 12 wobbled. The synchronization broke. A ripple went through the swarm. The latency Sarah had warned him about kicked in. As the chips overheated, the processing speed slowed. The drones couldn't calculate their positions fast enough to maintain the formation. Drone Marmophore 12 collided with drone La-089. The sound was like a gunshot. Crack. The crowd screamed. "Keep flying!" Mark shouted into his headset, his smile freezing into a rictus of terror. "Correct the formation." But it was a cascade failure. The collision sent debris flying into the rotors of the neighboring drones. One by one, they began to drop. It wasn't a graceful landing. It was a rain of fire. A burning drone smashed into the stage, 10 feet from where Mark stood. Another crashed into the empty front row of the VIP section, reserved for safety, thankfully. "Cut the feed!" Mark screamed at the cameras, waving his arms. "Cut the damn feed!" But the live stream didn't cut. 3 million people watched as the future of logistics rained down in a heap of smoking plastic and lithium fires. The crowd was stampeding. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Mark Reynolds stood alone in the center of the chaos, smoke billowing around him. He looked small. He looked like a child standing over a broken toy. In her office, Sarah didn't smile. There was no joy in this. It was a waste of engineering, a waste of resources, and a danger to public safety. "It's time," Sarah said, standing up. "Time for what?" David asked. "To gloat?" "No." Sarah adjusted her jacket. "Time to save the industry he just tried to destroy. Initiate the Vanguard press conference. We go live in 10 minutes.